Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Audrain Automobile Museum. And this, our final program in this exhibition, Early Landmarks in Automotive Engineering. We have been extremely gratified by the reception of this show. The attendance has been outstanding. Now, we had a fairly mildish winter, which sort of helped, but it has been cold, but it hasn't mattered. People have come out to the show in great numbers and been fascinated, as we all have been, by this incredible story of the progress in automobiles from 1886 to 1939. Certainly one of my favorite periods in automotive history, just simply because of the imagination. And in this talk tonight that J. Stanley Lemons is going to give us, you will certainly see a very interesting part of it, because one of the things about early automobiles, which I find so fascinating, is the fact that we all sort of have put in our heads the idea that automotive manufacturing is a very centralized thing. Today, it's actually become more decentralized than it was for most of the 20th century. But think about the fact that manufacturing would be centered in the places where the technology and the minds and the materials existed. And that's what we're going to find out about the great state of Rhode Island and its pivotal role in the development of the car, especially here in the East. And before we go on that, I just want to, of course, thank the great staff here at the Audrain who has worked so hard throughout this exhibition, put this together. Our executive director, David DiMuzio, and Alex Cull, and Brooke Morganti, and Nina Branch, and of course our great video team, Antonio and Steve and Sam. And so this has been a really wonderful thing. I'd like for you to give them a round of applause to help make this happen. And I'm also very excited to announce, because we have been so successful with bringing this to members, these programs, for our next exhibition, which we're very excited about, something completely different, Wonders in Wood on Land and Sea, that opens next Saturday, which is astonishing to think about the fact that all these cars look so comfortable sitting here, and there'll be mayhem here in the gallery next week. And that exhibition will feature three seminar programs. The first in early April from Evelyn Ansell, the curator of the Herreshoff Marine Museum, talking about Herreshoff manufacturing in Bristol. In early May, Warren Barker, senior instructor at IRIS, we'll talk about traditional methods of building wooden boats. And in late May or early June, Steve Babinski, the owner and founder of Automotive Restorations in Lebanon, New Jersey, and an award-winning restorer, will talk about the extensive use of woodwork in pre-war automobile coachwork. And among the items on display in the gallery will be a wooden buck that Steve used for working on a wonderful pre-war Horch. And he'll have some metal here, and you'll see all that. And you'll really get to see what the ties are between the marine world and the automotive world. And of course, here in Newport, to be able to bring that together is a very special thing that we're very, very proud of. But tonight, we had a chat. Alex reached out to Stanley about doing this talk, and understandably, he thought, well, this might be interesting. You know, I like what you guys do. Maybe I'll come down and check it all out and see what it is. And so obviously he's here tonight, so we passed his test, which we're very, very, very proud of and very, very grateful for. He is a professor emeritus of history at Rhode Island College, specializing in the history of American culture. And that's also something which I think is very important for us here at the Audrain. We love objects, we love cars, but it's about how cars fit in society, the people who made them, the people who use them, the effect they had on the society. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're very happy to welcome Stanley here tonight. He has received his PhD from the University of Missouri. What did you say, Missouri?
Missouri.
Missouri, thank you. In '67, and he taught here at the Rhode Island College until he retired in 2006. He's the author of many books and scholarly articles, and he's been twice recognized with the Award of Merit by the American Association of State and Local History for his contributions to Rhode Island history. So please join me in welcoming J. Stanley Lemons.
Yes, I did come down here to see what it was like, and I smiled the whole time I was here. I just looked around one car after another, and I was just, this is so beautiful, so beautiful. So I was really pleased that they asked me to come. I want to talk about the automobile coming to Rhode Island. It may be difficult to imagine what Rhode Island was like before the automobile came in. But in 1890, the state had virtually no paved roads beyond the city limits of any town or city. And there was nothing of what we would later become to call the automobile culture. Yet by 1910, the automobile was already reshaping the state with new laws, new regulations, new expenses, new delights, and new dangers. By then, there were filling stations, garages, auto supply stores, new and used car dealers, car insurance, auto togs and auto tags, songs and automotifs. The whole automobile culture was rapidly taking shape in the United States, and certainly in Rhode Island. As was alluded to a moment ago, New England was one of the places that the automobile industry began, particularly here in Rhode Island and in the Connecticut River Valley. By 1920, it had almost completely gone from all these places. In those years, in the early years of the 20th century, the automobiles industry was dynamic and chaotic, and Rhode Island was the home of a surprising number of automakers and manufacturers. I had Alex pass out a thing to you that was supposed to give, have you done that? Well, you can look at this as we go on, which gives you a list of all of the automakers of one kind or another that I was able to discover in researching this topic. In fact, the ALCO, which was manufactured in Providence, was arguably the finest automobile made in America prior to the First World War. Now, the idea of a self-propelled vehicle was not new. The Chinese had developed something like that in the 17th century. Even Leonardo da Vinci back in the 15th century had thought about it. But a practical one is something else. The French in 1796 had made a steam-powered tractor of a kind to pull cannons, but it was so big and so heavy that it didn't travel very well, and they found that horses were better for pulling cannons than that thing, so they junked it. The 19th century, however, brought the first practical uses of self-propelled vehicles, although those first self-propelled vehicles were trains and steamboats. Cars would have to wait until they had better roads. Until you had good roads, a car was impractical. Some historians regard the bicycle to be the most important technological innovation in the eventual development of the automobile. The bicycle industry began in France in the 1860s and spread over to England and the United States, to America, subsequent to that. But bicycles required better roads than the horse-drawn vehicles used. As a result, bicyclists mounted an enormous campaign, substantial and sustained campaign for good roads. For example, in May 10th, 1880, here in Newport, the League of American Wheelmen was organized, and one of its main goals was the improvement of public roads and highways. The effort accelerated when the great bicycle craze swept America in after 1885 with the introduction of the new safety low-wheeled bicycles that we now have. Thousands of bicycles were sold, and bicycle periodicals whipped up their enthusiasts to pressure politicians to do something about the roads and streets. Well, in the 1890s, motorists, automobile people, enthusiasts joined the bicyclists in campaigning for improved roads. The National League for Good Roads, founded at the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, began holding annual conventions. And the rising clamor then forced many states to undertake road improvements. Between 1892 and 1913, 26 states, including Rhode Island, passed legislation to finance, build, and maintain roads. The age of the automobile began in America, in the United States, in 1895. Before that, every automobile maker in America had made an experimental car of some kind, one-of-a-kind model. Not even two of them were made. But then in 1895, the periodicals, motorcycle, and the horseless age first appeared. George B. Selden, I think fraudulently, received his patent on the internal combustion engine, invented by somebody else, in fact, a man from Rhode Island by the name of Brayton. Nearly 500 other patent applications relating to the automobile arrived at the U.S. Patent Office in the summer of that year. And Gimbel's and Macy's both began to sell European-made cars in their stores. The Chicago Times-Herald sponsored the first road race in America on Thanksgiving Day, November 28, 1895. And the Duryea brothers organized the Duryea Motor Company, America's first commercial manufacturer of cars. Now, when the automobile finally arrived, it had to prove to the public that it was practical. Consequently, many of the activities of these early owners and enthusiasts was to show the people that this was a practical idea. And they used periodicals and propaganda, auto clubs, shows, rallies, meets, and races, all of which were intended to show the public that the automobile really worked. Motor races were one of the ways that car builders and promoters sought to show off the automobile. The first automobile track race, not just a road race, but a track race in America took place at the old Narragansett Park off Washington Street in Cranston, Rhode Island, in September of 1896. They planned to run a series of races 5 days during the time of the Rhode Island State Fair. The first day's race attracted 40,000 people to watch it. And the race began when the official declared, "Now go, if you can." Only one of the 8 cars could not go, but the 2 electric cars defeated all the gasoline cars. About 5,000 people came the next day to see the races, and then the next 2 days were washed out by a hurricane that came through that time. So, on the 5th day, an estimated 53,000 people came to see the final races. 53,000 people in 1896. The Rhode Island Automobile Club, which was organized in 1900, sponsored motor races at Narragansett Park, automobile tours around the state, and an annual hill climb on Thanksgiving Day, all of which was to sort of demonstrate and to stimulate people to want to have an automobile. They want to show off the glories and wonders of the new machines. Their first race meet at Narragansett Park in October of 1901 featured the famous French driver Henri Fournier in a 60 horsepower Mors, which zoomed around the track at 53 miles an hour. The Rhode Island Automobile Club races were a major event in the international racing calendar until 1904, when the Vanderbilt Cup races were started over on Long Island. The Automobile Club discontinued its race meet the next year, but the famous race driver, Barney Oldfield, put on a show at the State Fair in 1905 and attracted record crowds. The wealthy Newport social set had its own automobile activities, beginning with an automobile parade, like the carriage parades they have every year now, but there's an automobile parade on Bellevue Avenue in September of 1899. The following summer, Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr. gave an automobile outing to Narragansett Pier, and that summer and fall saw races on Newport's Second Beach and at Portsmouth's Aquidneck Park. Evidently, some of the younger drivers, daring guys, were racing up and down the back roads, which led to both Newport and Portsmouth to enact ordinances against speeding in June of 1900. Now, many of the most expensive foreign-made automobiles registered in Rhode Island were found in Newport and were owned by members of the social, you find their names in the social register. When the automobile age began, it was not evident which type of car would come out on top. At the end of the 1890s, the annual production of both electric and steam automobiles exceeded that of gas ones. Electric cars were briefly attractive, and in 1897, the nation had a substantial number of automakers who were building electrics, including the Pawtucket Motor Carriage Company, a subsidiary of the Campbell Manufacturing Machine Company. Their power was safer than gasoline, and even the steamers, used kerosene or gasoline to heat their boilers. The primary advantage of electrics was that they were easy to start and operate, and women especially favored them. Steamers were hard to fire up in the wintertime, and until a practical self-starter was invented for the gasoline car, many a person broke their wrist or their arm trying to crank the things up. But electrics had a limited range, their speed went down as the battery drained out, and they had poor hill climbing capacity, and they were more expensive to buy and operate than comparable steam or gasoline cars. The result was the vogue of the age of the electric car quickly passed. I remember hearing a guy just a few years back who was arguing that electric cars were a failed option to having cars. He was arguing that don't opt for electric cars today. The May 1905 registration in Rhode Island listed 1,030 autos, and of these only 13.5% were electrics. Most of those electrics were 2.5 horsepower Waverly runabouts. These were little in-town cars, oftentimes bought for wives of men who bought bigger automobiles. For example, Henry Lippett, who was a general manager of the Manville Company, a leading textile manufacturer and also governor of the state at one time, owned both a 20 horsepower Winton and a 2.5 horsepower Waverly electric. Well, more significant were the steam cars. Practical steam automobiles were created in the late 1880s, and at least a dozen American inventors built operable steamers in the period between 1860 and 1890. Several of Rhode Island's homegrown automobile experiments were made with steam vehicles. Steamers were certainly the most popular kind of auto by 1900 because they were easier to manufacture and to maintain than gasoline autos, and they could go faster and when they go further than electrics. In fact, the steam locomobile was the best-selling car in the United States in 1900 and 1901. The May 1905 registration list in Rhode Island found that the Stanley steamer to be the single most popular vehicle in Rhode Island, but all the steam-powered cars put together by that time constituted only about 19.5% of all the cars in Rhode Island. Despite the fact that a steamer set a world's record of 127 miles per hour at Daytona Beach in 1906, and that Stanleys were produced until 1924, the heyday of the steamer had actually passed by about 1902 and 1903. National automobile statistics for 1905 revealed that 65.3% of all vehicles were gasoline powered, and Rhode Island's figures were almost identical to that. So clearly, as early as 2000 or 19, what am I saying? As early as 1902, 1903, the gasoline automobile was leaving its rivals in the dust. It also meant that some of Rhode Island's automakers were on the wrong road because they manufactured steam-driven cars. At least, and you'll see this on this list, at least 30 automobile manufacturers and builders can be identified in Rhode Island between 1866 and 1919, and of these, 13 made steam vehicles. In the last decades of the 19th century, inventors and mechanics around this nation tried to create a practical motor vehicle, and Rhode Island was the home of several of these men. The earliest of these was Joseph Manton, who made his fortune by founding the American Ship Windlass Company and by inventing a steam engine to raise anchors. He built a steam-powered automobile in 1866 to win a bet with some friends that he could construct a horseless vehicle that was capable of taking him from Providence to his summer home in Longmeadow in Warwick. Despite the fact he got stuck on some sandy roads at part of the time, he won his bet. The thing was powered by a great big coal-fired vertical tube boiler set on the back of the vehicle. He drove it around in Providence for a few months before he decided it had no practical use, and so he got rid of it. The hair shops, I mentioned, since it's mentioned they were coming here, or going to be on the next program, the hair shops built a couple of steam cars, charcoal burning things, but they made two of them, and they were both not practical, and so they just abandoned that too, but that's in the 1880s. When the automobile age began in earnest in the mid-1890s, several local automobile makers used steam technology. Now this is not surprising at all, since this is the land of steam-driven ships and boats and all the rest of it. And Providence had some of the greatest steam engine manufacturers in the world. Providence itself was the home of the Corliss Steam Engine Company, and a number of other very prominent manufacturers who produced large and small stationary and marine steam engines and steam locomotives. They made trains and whole locomotives. Rhode Island's first automobile manufacturer was Leo Baldwin. He was born in Vermont in 1871, came to Providence, worked for the Rhode Island Locomotive Works, then worked for Brown and Sharp, and then for the Corliss Steam Engine Company and two other steam engine companies before he went to work for the Cruikshank Engine Company. This is a company that manufactured small marine steam engines. In April of 1898, the Providence Journal of Commerce carried the news that the Cruikshank was manufacturing horseless carriages to go 20 miles an hour. The Board of Trade Journal later claimed that the Cruikshank Engine Company was the first in the area to hang out a sign which said, horseless carriages built to order. Well, Baldwin oversaw the construction of a steam-powered delivery van for Shepherd's, Shepherd's Department Store in Providence. Its appearance on Labor Day of 1896 was front-page news in the Providence Evening Bulletin. A second truck, which was gasoline-powered, was made for Shepherd's, but this truck and the other one ran until their wheels wore out. That was the end of it, when the wheels were gone. I don't understand that myself. In 1897, Baldwin made an automobile engine for Alonzo T. Cross, the manufacturer of the cross pins that we all, maybe some of you have those cross pins, but I think they've gone out of business, haven't they? In 1897, he made this engine for Cross. Cross constructed an experimental one-of-a-kind 2-horsepower steam car and drove it around the streets of Providence for the next 6 years. Baldwin decided to manufacture automobiles himself and built one that passed the ultimate test for automobiles in those early years. He was able to climb up College Hill in Providence. He had to do it in sort of two starts. He got a head of steam up at the bottom of the hill, made it up to Benefit Street, cranked it up again with a head of steam, and made it on up to Prospect Street at the top of the hill. Baldwin's efforts encouraged him in 1899 to found the Baldwin Automobile Company on Fountain Street, where the Providence Journal had its offices for a long time. But he couldn't get a proper factory, so he moved off to Connellsville, Pennsylvania in March of 1900, where he produced the Baldwin until 1901. And they built about 300 cars there. He returned to Providence in 1901 to start the Baldwin Motor Wagon Company, which was described as, quote, a manufacturer of all kinds of steam automobiles from an ordinary carriage to an omnibus. That year he made 3 15-passenger steam omnibuses, which were shipped to Puerto Rico. In 1902, he switched from making steamers to selling them, calling his new endeavor the Central Automobile Exchange. He secured the Rhode Island license for a franchise for Stanley steamer and later added the White steamer. However, by 1905, he accepted the fact that the steam car was not the future, and he became the Providence agent for the National Automobile Company, which made gas cars. He still loved steamers and raced them around the state for years to come. Ironically, in 1938, he died from injuries suffered when he dozed off at the wheel of his car on a 4-lane highway and crashed into a wall near Quinnesset Memorial Cemetery in North Kingstown. A number of the early auto manufacturers clearly developed from small engine and bicycle repair shops, but a number of them came from large manufacturers who tried to join the automotive enterprise. The state was one of the nation's leading industrial powerhouses at the end of the 19th century. Providence was the 20th largest city in the United States at that time. While textile manufacturing was the state's #1 industry, textiles were served by the textile machine industry and the machine tools industries. Providence's 5 industrial wonders of the world's largest factories of their kind in the world, were all in the metal trades. These included Brown & Sharp, Nicholson File Company, American Screw Company, Goro Manufacturing Company, and the Corliss Steam Engine Company. Rhode Island simply teamed with machine shops and foundries, rubber and glass factories, leather goods manufacturers. They could make every part of a car at that time, of any automobile. In Providence in 1900, the International Power Company began making large steam trucks, auto trucks, as a sideline to the manufacture of locomotives. In 1901, the American Locomotive Company bought out International and continued making steam trucks. However, they recognized the direction of the automobile industry, and so they decided to build a French luxury automobile, gasoline car, under a license. And it had the kind of awkward name of the American Locomotive Motor Car, generally called the American Berliet. It was produced from 1906 to 1908, whereupon American Locomotive Company ended the license and began to produce its own car called the ALCO. I was hoping they could have had an ALCO here. The ALCO was probably the finest automobile made in the United States prior to World War I. It was big, superbly engineered, which won the 1909 and 1910 Vanderbilt Cup races. It cost from $6,000 to $7,500, making it one of the most expensive autos produced. Now, $6,000 in 1910 money is worth $189,000 in 2023 money. So if you had to buy that car today at those kind of prices, you would have paid $189,000 for one car. The average annual income for a middle-class family in the first decade of the 20th century ranged between $900 and $3,000. That, by the way, was about what doctors and lawyers made in those days, by the way. So, a $7,500 automobile would cost a middle-class family several years' worth of income. And in those days, they didn't have installment payments to buy a car. Typically, you put 20% down and pay the rest when the car was delivered. So if you've got $6,000 or $7,500, you could buy one of these things and pay it when it came on. A less expensive model of the ALCO was widely used for taxis, but the American Locomotive Company ceased production of the ALCO in August of 1913. The company took an account of its automobile division and discovered that they had lost an average of $460 on every vehicle they produced. Now, $460 in 1912 is equal to $14,187 today, to give you some idea of how expensive, what the losses were. Other Rhode Island industrial firms branched into the automobile business. Some attempted to manufacture whole vehicles, while others made automotive parts, and still others operated repair facilities. The Providence Board of Trade Journal boasted in 1913, at least 100 concerns are interested in the automobile industry and either make the whole of the benzine buggy or send away the parts for other people to assemble. The industrial character of Rhode Island attracted the Maxwell Briscoe Motor Company to open 2 factories in this state. Production of the Maxwell began in Rhode Island when Maxwell expanded into New England in 1906. They began over in Tarrytown, New York in 1904, producing only 10 cars that year. By 1906, they were up to 6,000 cars and expanded into Chicago and Pawtucket, Rhode Island. They bought the old Hope thread mill on Division Street and built 2,000 units there in 1906. Now, the importance of this automaker in Rhode Island economy is illustrated by the fact that in addition to the 500 skilled hands employed at the Pawtucket plant, Maxwell bought its engines from the Providence Engine Works and its gear works from Brown & Sharp. In 1909, they expanded into a larger plant in Cranston by buying a factory from the Atlantic Rubber Company. But by about this time, the entire auto industry had entered a consolidation phase, and Maxwell's president sought to be a leader and a dominant player in this. He attempted to create a huge auto manufacturing trust called the United States Motor Company, kind of like General Motors and General Electric and all these other consolidations of things at that time. It at one point involved some 130 affiliated companies and an inflated capitalization of $42.5 million. However, the entire enterprise collapsed and they went into receivership by September 1912. One of the companies that pushed them into receivership was Brown & Sharp, who sued them for non-payment of bills. Maxwell abandoned Rhode Island in 1913 when the company underwent reorganization and moved to Detroit. The withdrawal of Maxwell from Rhode Island was part of a general movement which saw the concentration of America's auto industry in Michigan. From Connecticut, for example, the Pope Company, the manufacturer of locomobiles, Stanley steamers, and Stephen Durier's, they all left in this period. The decline and fall of the auto production in Rhode Island was part of the disappearance of auto manufacturing in all of New England. And after the end of the ALCO and the Maxwell in 1913, only the little cycle cars of economy car ever reached production in Rhode Island. The last company even to plan to make a car in Rhode Island was the Greyhound Motors Corporation in 1919, 1920, and nothing ever came of their dreams. Now, to sell and serve the automobile, a whole range of products and services sprang into existence. The first automobile garage in Providence was opened by Martins and Clark in 1898 at the corner of West Exchange and Aborn Street. They advertised they could repair and store automobiles. In fact, they only had storage for one at that time. They soon was able to say they could have 12, and then eventually 150 spaces. In 1900, they began selling Locomobile and Dions. And in just a few years, the number of repair and service garages multiplied, and many of them provided parking and storage spaces, because already by that time, parking was already a problem in the city, especially in downtown. Some garages advertised that they had charging stations for electrics, and Narragansett Electric Company established its own charging stations. By 1908, Providence had 35 dealers, all of whom, except one, sold gasoline cars. That one, of course, was Leo Baldwin, but he had become an agent for the gasoline-powered national car. In the entire state, there were now 104 automobile dealers. In addition, there was a growing multitude of service stations, garages, tire stores, and rental offices, and shops that sold automobile monograms, clothing, cushions, covers, and tops. Now, it's hard to know exactly how many automobiles existed in Rhode Island any time prior to 1904, because auto registration did not begin until the June of that year. But the United States Department of Commerce estimated the number in 1900 in Rhode Island was 130 cars, placing Rhode Island 15th in the entire nation for the number of automobiles. By any count, the numbers shot upward. The first registration issued in August of 1904 had 767 automobiles. The number of autos reached 5,647 in 1910, and such a volume, of course, would demand better roads. As noted earlier, the first steps in improving the public roads in Rhode Island were stimulated by the bicycle. The Rhode Island chapter of the League of American Wheelmen sent a document in 1889 that pointed out the sorry state of Rhode Island's highways. They listed the number of miles of paved roads in the various towns. Most towns, including Warwick, Barrington, Warren, and all of the western towns such as Foster, Gloucester, Burrillville, Hopkinton, and so forth, did not have a single mile of a paved road. North Smithfield and Middletown had 1 mile each, and Cranston had 4 miles. Agitation led in 1895 to the General Assembly's response by adopting an act to appoint a state highway commission and authorizing the commissioner to construct a sample half-mile section of paved road in any town that requested it. In the end, almost none did. Unfortunately, taxpayers in those towns would have to pay for any roads that went in, and they thought it was too costly. That was true, by the way, earlier than that when the state tried to mandate schools. Those towns wouldn't do that either. It turned out only 12 sample sections were built. Reflecting this sentiment, the General Assembly repealed the law. But then they had to come back, and they passed another law in April 1902, creating a state board of public roads. And the following year, upon recommendation from the new board, the legislature established a system of state highways consisting of the 15 most important through roads in the state. Work began on this system in 1903, and in 1906, 1909, 1912, the General Assembly passed bonds which amounted to $1,800,000. This new expense was added to the state and town budgets. So the question was, how do you pay for it? Well, the one way you pay for it is to force people to register their cars at a cost, get a driver's license at a cost, and so forth and so on. And they even added a gas tax, finally at 1 cent per gallon in 1925. What is it now? I don't know. A lot more than that, yeah. Now, while with all this, with all the years, with these years, it began to see a general public that began to have an automobile culture. Magazines regularly featured automobiling in their covers and in their pages. The popular music of the period from 1896 to World War I included 54 songs that referred to automobiles, and 12 specifically mentioned a particular car, including In My Merry Oldsmobile, which was a hit in 1905. In fact, I read someplace that that was the most popular car song ever, even to the present time. In 1986, a historian wrote a history of courtship in the United States with the delightful title, From Front Porch to Back Seat, which traces the transformation in American courting and dating practices in the 20th century. If one were to judge solely by sheet music in the first decade of the 20th century, the automobile was changing the venue for romance. What do you make of the titles, these titles? Love in an Automobile, that's a car song from 1897. Or how about this one? Auto, you ought to take me in your auto, 1905. Or On the Old Back Seat of the Hickory Ford, 1916. And a dozen such songs, such as Motor Girl and My Auto Lady, focused on the independence of women in their automobiles. And new words like automobiling and motor gypsying and auto camping became part of the language of auto clubs, newspapers, travel writers, and camping goods manufacturers who promoted the freedom that the automobile gave. There were lots of touring camps in the 1920s, which then were transformed into tourist cabins in the 1930s. And I remember as a kid staying in some of those in the 1940s, which led mainly to motor hotels or motor motels by the 1940s, although the first motor hotel was built in California in 1925, but it had to wait till about the 1940s to spread across the country. Dining spots and resort areas sought to attract automobile traffic. For example, Rhodes on Pawtucket called itself the Autoist Mecca, and the Elm Cottage at Narragansett Pier promised automobile parties specially cared for. Indeed, a whole range of products catered to the motoring public, and some advertisers even stretched their appeal to motorists. For example, What Cheer Laundry declared, quote, "You can't drive a car with any degree of comfort when your collar is chafing your neck and making you cross and irritable." It promised to launder shirts and collars to promote comfort so that one could, quote, "get the full measure of enjoyment from automobiling." You find these as advertisements inside a little book that was published first in 1905 called "Who is That?" It listed all the cars by their plate numbers. So if you were driving along and saw somebody with plate number 70, you could look in your little book and say, "Ah, that belonged to so-and-so and such and such."
That's cool.
On the other hand, magazines and newspapers had a steady stream of articles decrying the new machines and the havoc they wrought. One editorial described it as, quote, "this war between the automobile and the rest of the world." He said that auto drivers think they are entitled to not merely the right of way, but all the way there is. A physician writing in the Saturday Evening Journal in 1905 warned that harmful effects on children, quote, "who are being literally whirled through the world at an age when their nervous systems need quiet and normal development." He said that speed mania caused nervous tension and neurosis. And there's no avoiding the fact that the number of automobile accidents, deaths, and injuries climbed steadily. Frightened runaway horses caused many accidents, but unregulated drivers and driving caused the total amount. When the first reckoning of deaths and injuries related to automobiles and trucks was made by the State Board of Public Roads. They found in 1912, Rhode Island suffered 16 dead and 185 injured. The following year, the number was 34 killed and 491 injured in auto accidents. Well, the joy and the sorrow of the automobile was most clearly illustrated in the Thanksgiving issue of the Providence Journal in 1907. The whole state was in an uproar over the death of a child, the second in 1 week, who had been killed by a speeding automobile. The front page political cartoon showed a sorrowing mother cradling her dead son in her lap, and in the background was a ghostly apparition of a car speeding down upon them. Yet that same Thanksgiving issue had a special section of the paper with an even larger illustration of a happy scene in which a driver and his family were arriving at the little country home of the children's grandparents for Thanksgiving. Well, that death of the child in Pawtucket was the trigger that caused the General Assembly to set the first automobile speed limits in Rhode Island, pass a law against driving while intoxicated, and so forth. Automobilists, in general, tended to act as if they were a persecuted breed. For years, they fought nearly every attempt to restrict or restrain them in the use of the machines. But the outrage of that week was such that John Shepard, speaking for the Rhode Island Automobile Club, was forced to declare, quote, "The speeding of automobiles in city streets or wherever people are passing to and fro is an outrage. Everybody realizes that it has got to stop. No automobile should be allowed to go so fast that it can't stop within a quarter of its length." The place for racing chauffeurs is in the cell. Well, the first session of the General Assembly passed a bill on April 15, 1908, setting the maximum speed limit in rural areas at 20 miles per hour, 15 in suburban areas, and 10 miles an hour in thickly settled areas. Now, while most people thought that 10 miles an hour was too fast, the Auto Club thought that it went too far. So immediately they set about to change the law, and in 1 month, the speed limits were revised upward. The new bill set the rural limit at 25 miles per hour and the speed limit in town at 15 miles per hour. The leader of that was Henry Lippett, who was, I mentioned earlier, owner of 20 horsepower Winton. Now, how is it possible to get the state legislature to change its mind so quickly? The answer becomes clear if you look at who owned the automobiles at that time. To put it simply, if the owners had all parked their cars in one lot, they could have had a convention of Republicans or a lodge meeting of the Masons. Present would be enough former and present General Assembly members to hold a rump session of the legislature. If an anarchist had thrown a bomb into the lot, they would have been able to kill many of Rhode Island's leading textile and industrial leaders. However, the many physicians there could have taken care of the casualties. One of the things you notice in looking at who owned cars was doctors bought cars at this time in great numbers, partly because they made house calls those days, and it was better to have a car than a horse to do that. In short, the automobilists in 1905 to 1908 were mostly important people. Not until the appearance of the Henry Ford's Model T in October 1908 could the dam holding the number of cars back beyond the reach of ordinary people was broken. That's why the numbers of automobile owners in Rhode Island skyrocketed from 3,171 in 1908 to 35,124 in 1919. Well, at the turn of the century, various commentators and enthusiasts touted the automobile as an answer to urban noise, pollution, and congestion. The prominent journalist Ray Stannard Baker wrote in McClure's magazine in July of 1899, quote, "It is hardly possible to conceive the appearance of a crowded wholesale street in the day of the automatic vehicle. In the first place, it will be almost as quiet as a country lane. All the crash of horses' hooves and the rumble of steel wheels on streets will be gone. And the streets will be cleaner because about 2/3 of all the dirt in the streets were dropped there by the horses." In fact, you know, in this period of time, New York City used to pick up about 1,000 horses a year that were left laying dead on the street by people who, maybe a hack or something, the horse died, they unhitched it and pulled the vehicle away and left the dead horse there. The reality was different. Far from being the solution to urban noise, pollution, traffic congestion, and safer than horse-drawn vehicles with their runaway horses, the automobile compounded all these problems while speeding drivers, noise and pollution, and increased numbers of vehicles jammed the streets seeking parking places. Traffic volume and congestion increased, and in August 1910, Providence instituted one-way streets in downtown Westminster and Weybosset and placed traffic cops at 26 of the most busy intersections. And instead of road dirt, the air now became filled with choking clouds of smoke, that's a quote, and the roar of unmuffled engines. But the police rarely did anything about these things. Furthermore, motor vehicles had a calamitous impact upon the interurban and street railway systems. In 1908, 1909, the trolley system in the state were flourishing, but by 1912, all the companies were in trouble. Increasingly, people commuted by automobiles to work, and autos were used for pleasure, taking away the weekend fares of the trolley parks, such as Rocky Point and Crescent Park. No longer one had to live within walking distance of a streetcar line, and people could go anywhere for their amusement. The Rhode Island Company, which carried 80 million passengers per year before 1910, was forced into receivership by 1919. A special commission of the General Assembly investigated its financial condition and found that they had heavily lost money for years before 1919. In the 1920s, all the state's street railways, systems, and interurban lines disappeared. You know, you used to be able to get on an interurban line and go any place in Rhode Island, Westerly, Pascagoula, Newport, any place. They went everywhere. But they were replaced in some places by buses. And in the 1920s, the auto companies bought up the track lines and removed them. And that's where you have all these bikeways now you see. Those are on the old interurban lines. In addition, trucks replaced nearly all the branch railroads. But none of these consequences deterred the tide of automobiles, trucks, and buses that seized the public's imagination and captured the cities. At the end of the 19th century, many urban reformers had been urging the decentralization of American cities. And they thought that the street railway systems would accomplish that. However, the sheer arrogance, corruption, and disregard for public feelings that the traction companies exhibited provoked outrage and triggered political reform movements all across the Cleveland, Toledo, you can name a city, they almost all had the same problem. One example of traction and utility company contempt for public law and sentiment was the behavior of the Rhode Island Company, which owned the electric, gas, and streetway companies. In Providence in 1902, the Rhode Island Company disregarded the state's popular 10-hour law, which provoked the Carmen's Union into a strike, and then they brazenly broke the strike with police and imported strike breakers. Then they used their political muscle to get the law itself repealed by the General Assembly. Now, actions like these so disillusioned the people that when they began to be confronted by automobiles, they had no sympathy on the part of the public. The automobile bill simply accelerated the decentralization of the city and helped to break the streetcar companies. It seemed like a good thing at the time. Once the American public began its love affair with the automobile, it seemed willing to pay any price and to accept any perils and risks for the unprecedented freedom and mobility that the car brought. Back in the first decade of the 20th century, when automobiles were beyond the income of most Americans, one newspaper commentator wrote, "In less than 50 years from now, the working man, the mechanic, and the laborer will go to work from their cottages in the country in the automobiles." Well, the future came a lot sooner than he had anticipated. Well, thank you for listening to me.